The narrative of Skinwalker Ranch is not merely a ghost story, but a documentation of a geographical anomaly where the laws of physics appear to be suspended or manipulated by an intelligence that humanity has yet to comprehend. Before the scientific teams arrived with their magnetometers and spectrum analyzers, and before the property became the subject of intense media scrutiny regarding its asset value and paranormal history, the land itself held a reputation that predated the concept of the United States. Located in the Uintah Basin of Utah, roughly southeast of Ballard, this 512-acre plot serves as a convergence point for a spectrum of high strangeness that defies categorization. The phenomena reported here range from cryptozoological entities and poltergeist activity to unidentified aerial phenomena and portals that seem to traverse the fabric of space-time. The history of this region is steeped in the blood and folklore of the indigenous people, specifically the Ute tribe, who have long regarded this specific ridge as forbidden territory. According to their oral traditions, which serve as a historical record more reliable than many written contracts, the land is in the path of the Skinwalker. In their tongue, it is the Yi-Nal-Dalashi, a practitioner of dark arts who has achieved the ability to shapeshift into various animals by wearing their skins. This is not a fairy tale to the locals, but a tangible threat, a force of malevolence that resulted in a tribal dispute leading the Ute people to curse the Navajos and the land itself. The indigenous population will not enter the ranch, viewing it as a spiritual contamination zone where the very soil is saturated with negative energy. Hello and welcome to NightLine Podcast. I am Night, your host and investigator into the archives of the Unexplained. Today we are initiating a deep dive into the most scientifically studied paranormal hotspot in history. This account is based on the events experienced by the Sherman family, often referred to in literature under the pseudonym Gorman, and the subsequent investigations by the National Institute for Discovery Science, or NIDS, founded by billionaire Robert Bigelow. We are referencing the documented logs from Hunt for the Skinwalker by Dr. Colm Kelleher and journalist George Knapp, as well as local police reports and eyewitness testimonies from the Uintah Basin. To understand the isolation and the vulnerability of the victims, one must visualize the topography of the Uintah Basin. It is a high desert bowl surrounded by mountains that seem to trap energy within their perimeter. The economy of the region relies heavily on oil extraction and cattle ranching, industries where risk management and property insurance are standard concerns. In 1994, Terry and Gwen Sherman purchased the ranch with the intention of breeding high-quality hybrid cattle. They were looking for a retirement investment, a tangible asset that would grow in value and provide a serene environment for their teenage children. The property had been vacant for years, sitting on the market like a distressed asset that no broker could offload. When the Shermans finalized the real estate transaction, they discovered odd clauses in the purchase agreement. The previous owners had explicitly forbidden digging on the land and had installed heavy-duty deadbolts on every single door inside the main house, not just the exterior entrances. There were large metal chains utilized to secure the closet doors, suggesting that the threat was expected to originate from within the home or that the previous occupants were trying to keep something contained. At the time, the Shermans dismissed these anomalies as the eccentricities of paranoid elderly owners, a miscalculation that would cost them their peace of mind and financial stability. The atmosphere of the ranch was oppressive from the moment they unlocked the iron gate. The geography of the ranch is dominated by a ridge that runs along the property, a formation that would later be identified by observers as the primary stage for the aerial phenomena. Upon moving in, the family noticed that the silence of the basin was unnatural. It was not the quiet of a peaceful countryside, but the silence of a predator lying in wait. The local community in Ballard and Roosevelt seemed to hold a collective breath, aware that the property had changed hands, but unwilling to warn the newcomers of the history that plagued those acres. The Shermans were industrious people, focused on the logistics of moving their herd and repairing the neglected fencing. They were grounded in the reality of agricultural economics, concerned with mortgage rates and cattle prices, not folklore. However, their worldview was challenged almost immediately by events that suggested the land was already occupied by an invisible tenant who claimed absolute dominion over the territory. The first sign was not a visual manifestation, but a sense of being watched, a psychological pressure that induced cortisol spikes and anxiety in every family member. This was the calm before a storm that would defy every known classification of zoology and physics. The escalation of high strangeness began on a day that seemed perfectly mundane. Terry Sherman and his father were out in the pasture attending to a newborn calf when they spotted a creature observing them from the edge of the field. It appeared to be a wolf, but its dimensions were biologically incorrect. This animal stood nearly waist-high to a grown man, possessing a muscular density and a head size that far exceeded that of a timber wolf or any canine species native to North America. The creature displayed no fear, a behavior that is atypical for wild predators, which usually avoid human contact to minimize risk. It trotted calmly across the field, approaching the family with a demeanor that seemed almost domesticated, or perhaps calculatedly deceptive. The animal allowed the family to pet it, an action that lowered their defenses. However, the situation turned violent in an instant. The massive wolf walked over to the calf, which had its head through the bars of a corral, and clamped its jaws around the animal's snout. The attack was not frantic, it was methodical. Terry attempted to kick the wolf away, but the creature remained immovable, anchored by a strength that felt mechanical rather than biological. Realizing the immediate threat to his livestock asset, Terry retrieved a .357 Magnum revolver from his truck. He fired at point-blank range into the creature's ribcage. Under normal ballistic circumstances, such a shot would incapacitate or kill a biological organism. The wolf did not even flinch. It continued to crush the calf's snout. Terry fired again, and then a third time. The creature eventually released the calf, but did not collapse. It simply looked at Terry with eyes that were described as having a cold, deep intelligence, devoid of the panic usually seen in wounded animals. Terry then retrieved a heavy-caliber rifle and shot the creature again as it trotted away. A chunk of flesh was blown off the animal, yet there was no blood trail. The creature did not limp or cry out. It simply exited the property with a casual gait, vanishing into the dense brush near the creek. When Terry and his son tracked the animal, the footprints abruptly stopped in the middle of a muddy patch, as if the creature had been lifted vertically into the air. Upon examining the piece of flesh that had been severed, they noted it looked like rotten meat and smelled of sulfur and decay, suggesting the organism was either dead while moving or was a biological construct that merely simulated the living animal. Following this encounter, the ranch transformed into a theater of the absurd. The phenomena moved from the pastures into the sanctity of the home, violating the family's privacy and security. Objects within the house began to move on their own, a classic poltergeist presentation, but with a malevolent twist. Heavy iron hairbrushes would vanish from the bathroom and reappear days later inside the microwave. Groceries that had been unpacked and placed in the cupboards were found repacked inside the bags in the middle of the floor. This was not merely the displacement of objects. It was a psychological operation designed to erode the family's sanity. Doors that were locked and bolted were found wide open, swinging in the wind. The family reported hearing heavy footsteps pacing in the kitchen while they were in the living room, footsteps that sounded like boots on linoleum, yet no intruder was present. The mental health toll on the family was severe, comparable to the trauma suffered in war zones. They began sleeping in the same room, huddled together with weapons, their sleep interrupted by the sounds of heavy machinery operating beneath the ground and voices speaking in a guttural, intelligible language that seemed to emanate from the air itself. The terror was not confined to the interior. Outside, the Shermans began to see unexplained lights. These were not stars or aircraft, but structured orbs of light that maneuvered with intelligent control. The most feared were the small blue orbs, which the family described as killer lights. These orbs buzzed like bees and induced a paralyzing fear. On one occasion, the family dogs chased these orbs into the darkness. The Shermans heard the dogs yelping in distress, followed by a sudden silence. The next morning, they found only 3 scorched circles on the ground where the dogs had been. The animals had been completely incinerated, erased from existence, without a trace of bone or teeth remaining. This event marked a turning point where the family realized they were dealing with a force that had the capability and the willingness to inflict lethal harm. The financial implications of staying on the ranch were becoming disastrous, but the fear of leaving and being followed paralyzed them. They were trapped in a contract with the unknown, holding a liability that no insurance company would ever cover.
The assault on the Shermans' livelihood escalated with the systematic mutilation of their cattle herd. This phenomenon is one of the most disturbing aspects of the Skinwalker Ranch narrative because of the physical evidence it leaves behind. The Shermans would find their prize cattle dead, but the manner of death defied conventional predation. There were no claw marks, no signs of struggle, and crucially, no blood. The animals appeared to have been dropped from a height or killed instantly by a mechanism that stopped the heart without trauma. Specific organs, eyes, ears, tongues, and reproductive organs were removed with surgical precision. The cuts were cauterized, smooth as if done by a laser or a high-heat instrument, lacking the jagged tearing associated with coyotes or mountain lions. In one instance, a cow was found dead in the snow, surrounded by its own hoof prints, with no other tracks approaching or leaving the carcass. It was as if the predator had hovered above the animal. The loss of these animals was a significant financial blow, creating a deficit in the ranch's operational budget that pushed the Shermans toward bankruptcy. They invited local law enforcement and veterinarians to investigate, but the professionals were baffled. There was no crime scene evidence that fit any known criminal profile or predator behavior. The strangeness reached its apex with the appearance of portals. The Shermans and later investigators reported seeing the sky open up. They described an orange, glowing structure that resembled a tunnel or a wormhole opening in the night sky. Through binoculars, Terry Sherman claimed to see what looked like a different world on the other side of this portal, a blue sky with a different horizon. He reported seeing black, triangular craft emerging from these rifts, silently gliding over the property before accelerating at impossible speeds. Shadowy figures were seen crawling out of these portals and dropping into the darkness of the ridge. These were not hallucinations. They were sightings corroborated by multiple family members simultaneously. The ranch seemed to be a transit station, a terminal for entities entering and exiting our reality. The psychological pressure was compounded by the fact that these entities seemed aware of the family's actions. If Terry planned to patrol the west field, the activity would occur in the east field. If he set up cameras, the equipment would be dismantled or the wires cut by unseen hands. The intelligence was always one step ahead, displaying a tactical superiority that suggested it could read their intentions or monitor their communications. Word of the events at the ranch eventually leaked to the press, catching the attention of Robert Bigelow, a wealthy entrepreneur with a deep interest in the paranormal and the funds to support a massive investigation. Bigelow purchased the ranch from the Shermans, who were desperate to liquidate the asset and escape the nightmare. This transaction marked the end of the Shermans' tenure and the beginning of the NIDS era. Bigelow brought in a team of PhD scientists, former intelligence officers, and law enforcement veterans. They established a command post, installed surveillance cameras, and secured the perimeter with the rigor of a military operation. They employed strict non-disclosure agreements, ensuring that the data collected would remain proprietary. The shift from a family struggle to a scientific inquiry changed the dynamic of the haunting. The intelligence seemed to accept the challenge. When the NIDS team arrived, they were not met with silence. They were met with a ramp-up of activity that seemed designed to test their equipment and their resolve. The phenomena began to interact with the scientists, engaging in a game of cat and mouse, where the mouse was a team of highly trained experts and the cat was a force that could manipulate the electromagnetic spectrum and the human mind. The ranch was no longer a home. It was a laboratory where the subjects of the experiment were the humans themselves.
Following the acquisition of the ranch by Robert Bigelow and the establishment of the National Institute for Discovery Science, NIDS, the property underwent a radical transformation from a distressed agricultural asset into a high-security research facility. The deployment of surveillance technology was unprecedented for a private investigation, involving the installation of multiple high-resolution video cameras, magnetic anomaly detectors, and radiation monitoring devices across the 512 acres. The objective was to secure tangible evidence that could withstand the scrutiny of peer review and potentially alter the landscape of aerospace physics and defense contracting. However, the intelligence inhabiting the ranch did not react like a biological specimen or a passive geological phenomenon. It reacted like a strategic adversary engaged in counterintelligence warfare. The scientists, many of whom held security clearances and had backgrounds in law enforcement or theoretical physics, quickly realized they were not the observers but the observed. The phenomenon displayed a precognitive ability to anticipate the placement of sensors, often manifesting in the exact blind spots of the camera arrays or occurring mere seconds after equipment had been powered down for maintenance. This was not random chance, it was a deliberate demonstration of superiority, a game of cat and mouse where the roles were constantly reversed. One of the most chilling incidents during the NIDS tenure involved the destruction of surveillance equipment. Cameras housed in hardened weatherproof casings were found ripped apart with a force that exceeded human capability. The internal wiring was shredded and the heavy plastic housing was torn as if it were paper. In one specific instance, a camera observing a known hotspot was dismantled, and the footage leading up to the destruction showed nothing but a sudden cessation of the signal. There was no approach, no tool marks, and no footprint evidence in the mud below the pole. It was as if an invisible force had simply reached out and crushed the technology. This destruction of property raised significant questions regarding liability and asset protection, as the equipment was expensive and the damage was inexplicable. Furthermore, the scientists began to report visual anomalies that defied optical physics. They observed what appeared to be camouflage effects, similar to the shimmer of heat haze or the distortion seen in the film Predator moving through the trees. When they fired at these distortions or attempted to trap them, the entities would vanish or move with a velocity that created sonic disturbances. The team was dealing with an operator that could manipulate the visual spectrum and potentially the local gravity field. The biological threats also evolved during this phase. The team encountered cryptozoological entities that did not match any known taxonomy in the North American continent. On a night watch, 2 scientists observed a large humanoid creature perched in a tree, peering down at them with yellow, self-luminous eyes. Thinking it was a large bear or a mountain lion, they fired a high-powered rifle at the target. The creature fell from the tree, landing with a heavy thud that resonated through the ground, suggesting a significant mass. However, when they rushed to the site to collect the specimen, expecting to find a carcass that would revolutionize biology, they found nothing but a single set of tracks that resembled those of a massive raptor or a prehistoric biped. The tracks continued for a few yards and then abruptly vanished, as if the creature had dissolved or engaged a cloaking mechanism. This encounter profoundly shook the researchers, forcing them to consider that they were dealing with interdimensional travelers or shapeshifters that could manifest physical form temporarily before reverting to an energy state. The psychological stress on the team was immense, leading to high turnover rates and a constant reevaluation of their safety protocols and life insurance validity while operating in the zone.
As the investigation deepened, transitioning from the NIDS era to the involvement of the Defense Intelligence Agency, Through programs like the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Applications Program, the phenomenon, later coined as the Hitchhiker Effect, represented a virulent spread of the paranormal infection. Intelligence officers and scientists who spent significant time on the property began to report high strangeness following them home, crossing state lines to Virginia, Maryland, and Nevada. It became evident that the phenomenon was not tied to the land, but attached itself to the consciousness of the observer. Family members of the researchers who had never set foot in Utah began to experience poltergeist activity, seeing shadow figures standing at the foot of their beds and witnessing orbs of light floating through their suburban homes. This contagion aspect transformed the investigation from a localized scientific inquiry into a national security concern, as it implied that the entity could infiltrate secure locations and impact the lives of personnel thousands of miles away. The legal and ethical implications were staggering. How does a government contractor indemnify employees against a supernatural attachment that terrorizes their families? The physiological effects on the human body were equally alarming and documented in medical reports. Individuals who had close encounters with the orbs or the unknown aerial craft often suffered from acute radiation sickness, presenting with symptoms such as nausea, hair loss, and beta burns on their skin. In one severe case, a researcher developed a rare, aggressive autoimmune disease and life-threatening cellular abnormalities immediately following an encounter with a blue orb that passed through his torso. The medical bills and the complexity of the diagnosis mirrored those of toxic exposure cases found in industrial litigation. Yet the source of the radiation remained unidentified. The ranch seemed to emit transient bursts of high-energy gamma rays and microwave radiation that could cook biological tissue from the inside out. The soil samples taken from the property showed inexplicable magnetic signatures, and the very ground seemed to be charged with an energy that could drain fully charged batteries in minutes and cause sophisticated avionics to fail. The risk to human health was undeniable, leading to the conclusion that the ranch was a hazardous environment, a radiological hot zone disguised as a cattle farm. The government's interest, specifically through the investigative efforts led by figures associated with the Pentagon, focused on the weaponization potential of these anomalies. If the intelligence could manipulate human perception, disable electronic systems, and traverse dimensions, it represented the ultimate strategic advantage. However, the entity refused to be quantified or controlled. It displayed a sense of humor, often a dark and mocking one. It would perform impossible feats when the cameras were off and cease activity when the recording started, effectively trolling the military-industrial complex. The Dino Beaver incident, where investigators saw a creature resembling a prehistoric hybrid, and the sightings of the bulletproof wolf were demonstrations of its ability to pull imagery from the subconscious minds of the observers and manifest it into reality. The ranch was a mirror, reflecting the fears and the cultural expectations of those who walked its soil. It was not just a haunted location, it was a psycho-reactive environment that fed on the emotional energy of its visitors, creating a feedback loop of terror and wonder that left permanent psychological scars on everyone involved. analyzing the phenomena of Skinwalker Ranch through a lens that transcends material science and touches upon the metaphysical, it becomes clear that we are not dealing with extraterrestrials in the conventional sense of nuts and bolts spacecraft from another planet. We are interacting with an intelligence that inhabits the locus or dimensions that overlap with our own. In the context of Eastern spiritual philosophy, these entities resemble the asuras, titans, or demigods who possess iddi, supernatural powers, but lack the wisdom and compassion of enlightened beings. They are tricksters, guardians, and testers of humanity. The ranch acts as a thin place, a tear in the veil between the Manusa Loka, human realm, and these lower or parallel planes. The entities are not necessarily evil in a simplistic dualistic sense, but they are dangerous because they operate on a frequency that disrupts human biology and sanity. They feed on loosh, an esoteric term for the emotional energy generated by fear, confusion, and awe. When the scientists in the Shermans reacted with terror, they were essentially providing sustenance to these beings, strengthening the manifestation. The intelligence at Skinwalker Ranch is a teacher of the harshest kind. It demonstrates the impermanence and the malleability of what we call reality, Maya. It shows us that our physical laws are merely local ordinances that can be overruled by a higher consciousness. This entity is likely not a bodhisattva or a being of high dharma, for it creates chaos rather than peace. It is a dweller of the threshold, perhaps bound to that specific geography due to ancient curses or geological alignments that create a natural portal. For those who died or suffered on the ranch, such as the animals mutilated or the humans who contracted illnesses, their suffering serves as a grim reminder of our vulnerability. From a karmic perspective, the ranch is a trap for the ego. Those who go there seeking to conquer, to quantify, or to own the unknown are humbled and broken. The Hitchhiker Effect is a manifestation of attachment. By obsessing over the darkness, the researchers invited the darkness into their own consciousness, allowing it to follow them home. It proves that the mind is the forerunner of all states. Where the mind goes, reality follows. Therefore, the lesson of Skinwalker Ranch is one of respect and boundaries. There are places in this world that are not meant for human habitation or exploitation. We must learn to coexist with the unknown without trying to dominate it. If you are listening to this and feel a pull towards the dark, the mysterious, or the forbidden, take heed. Do not invite these energies into your life through obsession or reckless curiosity. Protect your mind with mindfulness and positive intent. The universe is vast and filled with beings that we cannot comprehend, and not all of them wish us well. If you have ever felt a presence that you could not explain, or if you have seen lights in the sky that moved with intelligent purpose, I invite you to document your experience in the comments below. Your story adds to the collective data of our reality. I wish you safety, wisdom, and the protection of the light. Please subscribe to NightLine Podcast and ring the notification bell to join our community of truth seekers. Forgive me if any details were recounted in error. Tell me, what forbidden location should we investigate next?